The crimson sun hung low over the Pacific as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo gazed through his binoculars at the endless expanse of ocean. It was June 3rd, 1942, and the most powerful naval strike force in Japanese history was bearing down on a tiny coral atoll that few Americans could even pronounce correctly: Midway. To Nagumo, it was merely another stepping stone in the Empire's inexorable march across the Pacific. To Admiral Chester Nimitz, hidden in his underground bunker at Pearl Harbor, it was the bait in the most audacious trap ever conceived. The Japanese First Air Fleet, Kido Butai, cut through the swells with mechanical precision. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the steel heart of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's master plan. These floating airfields had delivered the devastating blow at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, and their pilots were the finest naval aviators in the world. Veteran flyers who had honed their skills over China now prepared for what they believed would be another easy victory against the demoralized Americans. What Nagumo didn't know was that every radio transmission his fleet had sent over the past weeks had been intercepted, decoded, and analyzed by a small team of cryptographers in Hawaii. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo had cracked the Japanese naval code, JN-25, giving Admiral Nimitz an unprecedented glimpse into enemy intentions. The Americans knew exactly when and where the Japanese would strike. As referenced in Walter Lord's comprehensive account, Incredible Victory, the intelligence breakthrough was so complete that Nimitz could position his vastly outnumbered fleet, just 3 carriers against 4, at the precise coordinates where they could ambush the Japanese. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, lay in wait northeast of Midway like hunters in a blind. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. The Japanese, supremely confident in their naval superiority, sailed into what they believed was an undefended trap of their own making. Instead, they were heading toward the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar, one that would prove that superior intelligence could overcome superior numbers. On the evening of June 3rd, Japanese reconnaissance planes finally spotted American ships, but the reports were confusing and incomplete. Nagumo's staff dismissed them as minor vessels, unaware that they had glimpsed the edge of a perfectly positioned ambush. The admiral retired to his cabin, satisfied that tomorrow would bring another glorious victory for the emperor. He had no way of knowing that his carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were sailing toward their doom under a canopy of stars that would soon witness one of history's most stunning reversals of fortune. The pieces were in place. The hunters had become the hunted, though only one side knew it yet. The first rays of June 4th painted the Pacific in shades of gold and amber as Vice Admiral Nagumo's carriers prepared to launch their initial strike against Midway. At 0430 hours, 108 aircraft roared from the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that echoed across the waves. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the formation toward the unsuspecting atoll, confident that his bombers and fighters would pulverize the American defenders into submission. But even as the Japanese strike force disappeared over the horizon, Nagumo faced a critical decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his brief life. Following standard doctrine, he had kept 93 aircraft in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs specifically designed to sink enemy warships. These planes sat on his flight decks, fueled and ready, waiting for the discovery of American naval forces that Japanese intelligence insisted were still hundreds of miles away in Pearl Harbor. At 0534, a Japanese reconnaissance plane radioed a message that sent shockwaves through the flagship Akagi. Have sighted what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo's blood ran cold. American ships? Here. It was impossible. Yet there they were, precisely where they shouldn't be. The admiral faced an agonizing dilemma. His first wave was already pummeling Midway, but Tominaga had radioed back requesting a second strike to finish the job. Meanwhile, enemy ships lurked somewhere beyond the horizon, their composition and intentions unknown. Should he rearm his reserve aircraft for another land attack, or keep them ready for the naval battle that logic said couldn't happen? Nagumo chose poorly. At 0715, he ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed with land-based ordnance. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs were wheeled away and replaced with high-explosive bombs suitable for attacking ground targets. It was a decision born of experience. Every previous campaign had followed this same pattern, but it would prove catastrophically wrong. 30 minutes later, another report arrived that changed everything. Enemy force, accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier. Nagumo's face went white. An American carrier task force. Here, now, when his decks were cluttered with rearming aircraft and his first strike was still returning low on fuel, he immediately ordered his planes rearmed with ship-killing weapons, but the damage was done. Precious time had been lost, and his flight decks were now choked with aircraft, ordnance, and fuel lines, a floating ammunition depot waiting for a spark. The Japanese had been caught completely off guard, exactly as Admiral Nimitz had planned. Their supposedly invincible carriers, masters of the Pacific for 6 months, now found themselves in the most vulnerable position imaginable, surprised, divided, and unprepared. The hunters had walked directly into the trap, and the steel jaws were about to slam shut. As Nagumo struggled with his impossible situation, American dive bombers were already launching from Enterprise and Yorktown, racing toward their date with destiny. Commander Wade McCluskey circled high above the empty Pacific, his fuel gauge showing dangerously low levels, and his squadron of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers spread out behind him in formation. It was 0920 on June 4th, and Task Force 16's air group should have found the Japanese carriers by now. Instead, they had arrived at the coordinates provided by intelligence to find nothing but endless blue water stretching to the horizon. McCluskey faced a pilot's worst nightmare. He was running out of fuel over hostile waters, with 37 aircraft depending on his navigation. The Japanese fleet had vanished like a mirage, and every minute of searching brought his squadron closer to ditching in the ocean. But McCluskey was no ordinary pilot. He was a seasoned naval aviator who understood that battles were won by thinking, not just flying. Banking his Dauntless to the northwest, McCluskey followed his instincts and the faint wake of a Japanese destroyer racing across the swells. Below, destroyer Arashi was desperately trying to rejoin the main force after depth-charging the American submarine Nautilus. Unknown to its captain, the warship was drawing the American dive bombers directly toward their target like an arrow pointing to the heart of Nagumo's fleet. Meanwhile, the Japanese carriers were in complete chaos. Admiral Nagumo's flight decks resembled floating junkyards, cluttered with aircraft being frantically rearmed for the third time that morning. Fuel lines snaked between bombers and fighters, while ordnance crews rushed to load the correct weapons. The first strike against Midway was beginning to return, and these battle-damaged aircraft needed immediate landing space. Yet Nagumo's reserve strike force still wasn't ready to launch against the American ships. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 had already found the Japanese carriers, but their attack had been a disaster. Flying obsolete Douglas Devastators at wave-top level, the torpedo bombers were sitting ducks for Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Waldron and 14 of his 15 pilots died in the attack, their torpedoes ineffective against the maneuvering Japanese carriers. But their sacrifice served a crucial purpose. They drew the Zero fighters down to sea level, leaving the high altitude undefended. At 10:22, McCluskey's persistence paid off. Through the scattered clouds, he spotted the wakes of 4 aircraft carriers arranged in a box formation, their flight decks packed with aircraft. It was the most beautiful and terrifying sight any American pilot had seen since Pearl Harbor. The entire Japanese mobile force caught with their pants down. "Attack! Attack!" McCluskey radioed, pushing his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive toward the carrier Kaga. Behind him, 17 more dive bombers followed, their engines screaming as they plummeted toward their targets at over 300 miles per hour. The Japanese carriers, caught in the middle of refueling and rearming operations, had no fighters at altitude to intercept them. What happened next would be remembered as the most decisive 5 minutes in naval history. 3 American bombs struck Kaga in rapid succession, turning the flight deck into an inferno of exploding aircraft and fuel. Lieutenant Richard Best's section attacked Akagi, the Japanese flagship, scoring a direct hit that detonated bombs and torpedoes stacked on deck. The explosion was so violent it could be felt 20 miles away. Japanese firepower, supreme in the Pacific for 6 months, was being systematically destroyed by a handful of American dive bomber pilots who had found their targets through skill, luck, and the enemy's own fatal mistakes. The most devastating 5 minutes in Japanese naval history began at precisely 0:10:24 as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers screamed down from 14,000 feet toward their unsuspecting targets. Below them, the 4 carriers of the Kido Butai presented a sight that would have made any naval aviator's heart race. Flight decks packed with aircraft, fuel lines everywhere, and not a single Zero fighter at high altitude to intercept the incoming Americans. On the carrier Kaga, Captain Jisaku Okada was supervising the frantic rearming operations when the first Douglas Dauntless appeared overhead like a bird of prey. The 1,000-pound bomb struck the flight deck near the island superstructure with a thunderous roar, instantly igniting aviation fuel and starting a chain reaction among the armed aircraft. Within seconds, secondary explosions began ripping through the ship as bombs and torpedoes detonated in sympathetic blasts that sent pillars of flame and smoke hundreds of feet into the air. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Richard Best led his section against the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's pride and joy. Best's bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar bay, where it found a perfect target. Dozens of aircraft loaded with fuel and ordnance. The carrier that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier was transformed into a floating crematorium in the space of a few heartbeats. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron from Yorktown arrived at the same moment, adding their weight to the devastating attack. Their target was Soryu, and their accuracy was just as deadly. 3 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession, turning her flight deck into a sea of fire and twisted metal. Captain Ryusaku Yanagamoto, a veteran of every major Japanese naval operation since 1937, found his ship transformed from a deadly weapon into a dying giant in less than 5 minutes. The scene on the Japanese carriers defied description. Men ran screaming through corridors filled with smoke and flame, while others leaped overboard to escape the infernos above. Aviation fuel created rivers of fire that flowed across steel decks, and the continuous explosions of aircraft ordnance turned each ship into its own private hell. The proud pilots who had dominated Pacific skies found themselves trapped below decks or burned beyond recognition on flight decks they had walked with confidence just minutes before. As referenced in Mitsuo Fuchida's first-hand account, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, the Japanese mobile force suffered catastrophic damage in less time than it takes to brew a pot of coffee. 3 of their 4 fleet carriers were burning wrecks, their aviation fuel and ordnance creating fire so intense that steel bulkheads glowed red-hot and rivets popped like gunshots. Admiral Nagumo, standing on Akagi's bridge as his flagship burned around him, could hardly comprehend what had happened. The most powerful naval strike force ever assembled had been caught completely off guard and systematically destroyed by a handful of American dive bombers. The surprise attack he had perfected at Pearl Harbor had been turned against him with devastating effectiveness. Only Hiryu remained undamaged, her captain already launching a counterattack against the Americans. But the damage was done. Japanese naval aviation, the sword and shield of their Pacific expansion, lay burning on the bottom of the ocean. The 5 minutes that began at 0:10:24 had changed the course of World War II in the Pacific forever. Rear Admiral Taemin Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of his flagship Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier, and watched 3 pillars of black smoke rising from his sister ships like funeral pyres against the azure Pacific sky. The man who had been instrumental in developing Japanese carrier tactics now faced the impossible task of salvaging victory from catastrophic defeat with a single ship against 3 American carriers. Yamaguchi was no ordinary naval officer. He was considered one of the most brilliant tactical minds in the Imperial Navy and had personally trained many of the pilots now burning in the wreckage of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. If anyone could pull off a miracle, it would be the admiral who had advocated for bold, aggressive action since the war began. But even his considerable skills faced odds that would have daunted Lord Nelson himself. At 11 o'clock, Yamaguchi launched 18 Nakajima dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters toward the American task force. These were among the finest pilots in the Imperial Navy, men who had cut their teeth over China and perfected their skills at Pearl Harbor. Leading them was Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, a veteran aviator whose bombing accuracy was legendary throughout the fleet. Their target, the American carrier Yorktown, damaged but still operational after surviving the Coral Sea battle just 1 month earlier. The Japanese strike found Yorktown at noon, catching the American carrier in the middle of refueling operations. Despite a heavy combat air patrol and intense anti-aircraft fire, Kobayashi's bombers pressed home their attack with suicidal determination. 3 bombs struck the carrier, starting fires and knocking out her boilers. Within minutes, Yorktown was listing and apparently sinking, exactly the kind of devastating blow that had characterized Japanese naval aviation for the past 6 months. But Yamaguchi's moment of triumph was short-lived. Even as his pilots celebrated their success, American dive bombers from Enterprise were already winging their way toward Hiryu. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led 24 Dauntless bombers in a textbook attack that caught the Japanese carrier just as vulnerable as her sister ships had been hours earlier. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, Hiryu joined her companions as a burning wreck. 4 bombs struck the carrier's flight deck and hangar bay, creating the same devastating chain reaction of exploding aircraft and aviation fuel that had doomed the other Japanese carriers. Admiral Yamaguchi, faced with the complete destruction of his command, chose the honorable path and went down with his ship, standing at attention on the bridge as the flames consumed the last hope of Japanese naval aviation. The battle that had begun with such confidence for the Japanese had become an unmitigated disaster. 4 fleet carriers, the core of their naval air power, lay burning or sunk in the Pacific. More importantly, the irreplaceable pilots and air crew who had given Japan dominance over the Pacific were dead or floating in life rafts, their years of training and experience lost forever. As night fell over the battlefield, Admiral Yamamoto faced the bitter truth. His masterpiece plan had not only failed, but had delivered the decisive victory to the Americans. The trap he had set for the American Pacific Fleet had instead become the graveyard of Japanese naval aviation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in the flag plot of his flagship Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, and contemplated the ruins of his career. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor and given Japan 6 months of unprecedented naval victories now faced the complete destruction of his most elite striking force. The radio reports streaming in from the battle area painted a picture so catastrophic that even his most pessimistic staff officers had trouble believing it. 4 aircraft carriers sunk or sinking. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots dead or missing. The First Air Fleet, Kido Butai, which had been the scythe of Japanese expansion across the Pacific, was now nothing more than burning wreckage scattered across 50 square miles of ocean. The most elite naval air force in the world had been destroyed in a single day by an enemy they had consistently underestimated. The human cost was even more devastating than the material losses. Japan had begun the war with fewer than 400 trained carrier pilots, and it took 2 years to produce a replacement. In contrast, American training programs were already churning out thousands of new aviators every month. The experienced pilots dying in the Pacific this day represented an investment in time and training that the empire could never replace, even if they had 2 years of peace to rebuild their shattered air arm. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, now floated in a life raft watching his carrier Akagi burn on the horizon. The pilot who had achieved immortality by leading the most successful surprise attack in naval history was now just another survivor hoping for rescue. His thoughts turned to the young pilots under his command, men who had followed him through months of victory and were now paying the ultimate price for their leader's miscalculations. The Japanese had fallen victim to their own success. 6 months of easy victories had bred an arrogance that blinded them to American capabilities and intentions. They had dismissed enemy intelligence gathering, underestimated American resolve, and ignored the industrial capacity that was already beginning to tip the balance of power in the Pacific. Most critically, they had allowed themselves to be caught completely unprepared by an enemy they considered beaten. As detailed in Gordon Prang's definitive study, Miracle at Midway, the Japanese defeat was not just tactical but strategic, marking the beginning of the end for their Pacific empire. The carriers burning in the Pacific represented more than ships and planes. They were the symbols of Japanese naval supremacy, and their loss would reverberate through every subsequent battle of the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Japanese naval aviation, and the man who had warned his government that they could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months, now faced the bitter irony that his prediction had come true exactly as he had feared. The 6 months were over, and American industrial might was beginning to assert itself with devastating effectiveness. As rescue ships raced to pick up survivors from the burning carriers, Yamamoto made the most difficult decision of his career: retreat. The man who had never lost a battle now ordered the remnants of his fleet to withdraw, abandoning Midway and accepting the first major Japanese defeat of the Pacific War. The rising sun had reached its zenith and was now beginning its inevitable descent toward a sunset that would illuminate the ashes of empire. Dawn on June 5th revealed a Pacific Ocean transformed. Where the day before 4 mighty Japanese aircraft carriers had cut through the swells with deadly purpose, now only oil slicks and floating debris marked their passage. The Kido Butai, terror of the Pacific for 6 months, had become a footnote in history, remembered not for its victories, but for the catastrophic defeat that marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the quiet strategist who had orchestrated this impossible victory, stood in his Pearl Harbor headquarters and contemplated intelligence reports that read like the answer to every American prayer since December 7th. The Japanese mobile force was in full retreat, their carriers either sunk or burning, their elite pilots dead or captured. In a single day, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted decisively toward the United States. The human drama continued to unfold across the battle area as rescue operations began in earnest. American destroyers and cruisers raced to pick up Japanese survivors, many of whom could hardly believe they had been defeated by the same Navy they had surprised at Pearl Harbor. Captain Clarence Aldrich of the destroyer Hughes later recalled pulling Japanese pilots from the water who kept asking how American aircraft had found their carriers so easily, unable to comprehend that their own radio transmissions had betrayed them. The wounded carrier Yorktown, reported sunk by Japanese pilots, was still afloat and under tow when submarine I-168 found her on June 6th. The Japanese submarine's torpedoes finally sent the battle-scarred carrier to the bottom, but her sacrifice had already served its purpose. Yorktown's air group had participated in the destruction of 2 Japanese carriers, making her loss a profitable exchange that no American admiral would have hesitated to make. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Midway marked the transition from Japanese offensive to American counteroffensive. The 6 months of easy conquest were over, and Japan now faced an enemy with superior industrial capacity, better intelligence, and growing tactical expertise. The student had become the teacher, and the lessons would be written in fire and steel across 1,000 miles of Pacific Ocean. The psychological impact on both sides was immeasurable. American morale, shattered at Pearl Harbor and battered through months of defeats, soared as news of the victory spread through the fleet and eventually to the home front. Conversely, Japanese confidence, built on an unbroken string of successes, cracked like a dam under the pressure of catastrophic defeat. The myth of Japanese invincibility died in the flames of 4 aircraft carriers on June 4, 1942. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's greatest naval strategist, understood the implications better than anyone. In his final report on the battle, he wrote that Japan had lost the war at Midway, though the fighting would continue for 3 more bloody years. The carriers could be replaced eventually, but the pilots never would be, and American industrial capacity was just beginning to reach full production. As the sun set on June 6th, the last Japanese survivors were pulled from the Pacific, and the great battle was over. The turning point of the Pacific War had lasted just 4 days, but its effects would reverberate until August 1945, when the rising sun finally set forever on the Japanese Empire. At Midway, American intelligence, courage, and determination had overcome Japanese experience, skill, and tactical superiority. The miracle had happened. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Pacific belonged to America once again. The trap had been sprung perfectly, and Japanese firepower was indeed neutralized when Midway caught their carriers off guard.